Should we get going? All right. Welcome everyone to the March webinar for Crisis Ready. We've been doing these monthly, and last month was our inaugural panel for getting started with Crisis Ready overall, the work streams that we've been initiating, particularly around response to the California wildfires, then work with epidemic response and with the GFDRR team at the World Bank around mobility data for emergency management. And we're really excited this week to have on Stefan Verhulst from the NYU Governance Lab, GovLab, to talk about one of the, I think, foundational pillars of the work that we've been engaged in going back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The pillars around Crisis Ready have been focused on a combination of readiness requirements. So on the one hand, data, scientific methods, scientific research questions, and then translational readiness. And what translational readiness means for us is around the ability to connect networks of researchers with response agencies, government, the people that are making decisions in a response context, so that they're able to actually utilize analysis in a real-time fashion for decision-making and for kind of thinking long-term as well about the kinds of issues that they're needing to factor into both public health and the response to emergencies. And Stefan's been doing just astonishing work, I think, around being able to understand the role that collaboratives of researchers, data providers, other practitioners have been playing in the response to the pandemic. So we would like, Stefan, do you want to go ahead and share your screen to get started? I wanted to give a little bit of a orientation to Zoom webinar. So we have the ability for folks to be able to put questions into the Q&A section. You can also upvote the questions if you'd like to make sure there's something that you want us to focus on during the Q&A period. So please go ahead and put questions in at any point in time. And once Stefan is finished talking, we'll have responses by Sachin Balsari and Caroline Bucky, and we're going to focus as well in that context in around questions of capacity building and making sure that as we move forward, we're helping to think about the institutional frameworks, the resources, and the knowledge and training required to be able to expand out the question of who is able to do this kind of work globally. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Stefan.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks for having me and for this introduction, which always worries me because it creates expectations that I might not be able to deliver here. But as was mentioned by Andrew, I would be delighted, and I am delighted to share a few of our lessons learned and also recent findings from some of the work that we've been doing with regard to the use of data for COVID-19, and specifically how different data sets, so-called non-traditional data sets, have been used in our effort to respond and also recover and be ready for pandemics. And before I start, let me give you a brief background around the GovLab. As Andrew was said, I'm the co-founder of the GovLab, or Governance Laboratory. We are based here in New York, and we are part of the Tandon School of Engineering of New York University. And our mission is to improve people's lives by changing how we govern, changing how we make decisions in the public interest by leveraging new technologies, new science, and new methods. And typically that has meant that we have focused on what we call two important assets that can be leveraged in the 21st century to really change the way we go about making decisions. And those typically are, on the one hand, people, which I'm not going to talk about today, which is all our efforts around collective intelligence, smarter crowdsourcing, and the like. But the other asset, surprise, surprise, and that's of course what I guess why Andrew asked me to join today. The other asset that we have focused on is of course data. And here we have really focused on how do we unlock and leverage data in order to improve the way we govern, improve the way we design services, improve the way we go about making decisions. And of course, that's, I think, what Andrew referred to, that's where this notion of translation of insight into action, of course, plays a critical role. And I will talk about that more later throughout this presentation. But these are just a few, examples of some of the projects that we have. One is like the Open Data Policy Lab, where we really try to advance the third wave of open data, which really focuses on publishing with purpose. Then we also have a data stewards network, and then the data collaboratives work that we've been doing as well. So these are just a selection of some of our work in the data space. Now, as Andrew said, I will mainly focus on our work around data collaboratives. If you go to the website, and I will put some links at the end in the chat as well for those that are interested to go deeper in what I've been saying here. But one of the areas that we have focused on is indeed data collaboratives, by which we mean a new kind of public-private partnership around the use and the sharing of data, typically involving, on the one hand, the private sector, on the other hand, the public sector, and then also quite often researchers and academics or others that might have expertise in order to extract insight from the data that then can be made actionable by having the ones that can subsequently act upon the data also be part of it. And if you go to the website, datacollaboratives.org, you will find probably the largest repository of examples of data collaboratives. And so that has provided us with some insight on how do you go about creating data collaboratives, which we also have been doing as a result, but also what are some of the trends that are emerging as it relates to data collaboratives. And I think one of the first elements from a more generic point of view, and then I will also share some of our work as it relates to data for COVID, of course. But I think the first big takeaway from the work that we do on data collaboratives is that there is no one way of doing this, right? And so what we have identified are like 6 kinds of models of data collaboratives, and they scale according to, on the one hand, more access, on the other hand, less access, right? So there is this kind of shades of openness of data that is determining the kind of data collaboratives that we see. And on the other hand, the openness of data on the one axis, the other axis is then quite often linked with the level of participation, the level of collaboration. And as a result of those 2 axes, we basically have those kind of 6 types of data collaboratives. And again, I'm not going to go into detail. And also, anyway, my talk today will be a little bit more meta because we have, like, anyway, as I said, hundreds of examples for each of those. And I'm not going to really go into the detail of some of those examples, but they range from, anyway, where it's fully open and where the use is almost independent, where you have like public interfaces to certain kinds of data, such as, for instance, an API that Zillow, a real estate company here in the US, is providing to its data in order to, for instance, understand gentrification or understand the housing market at a time of COVID-19, for instance. And then the other, and then in between, we have trusted intermediaries, we have data pools, we have research partnerships, and then also at the other end is actually where no data is shared, but the insights are shared, such as, for instance, the JP Morgan Institute that is providing no access to data, but is sharing the insights that they extract from the data that could inform decision-making moving forward. Now, none of this will be new here, that of course, if we talk about extracting insight from data, there are a whole range of value propositions and types of questions that can be answered. And so indeed, we see data collaboratives being used to understand the situation, explain the situation, predict the situation, and ultimately also informing on how one should respond given the situation. And so these are, of course, the typical four kinds of questions and analytical approaches, and we see all of those embraced by data collaboratives. Now, a key question that I quite often get, which I also why I've put this in this slide deck, is also, well, Stefan, you work on data collaboration and especially on having the private sector share its data. You must be very naive, because why would a corporation share its jewels with the wider world? And that's also an area that we've done quite a lot of work on, which is really trying to understand what are the incentives for data collaboration, which is, by the way, essential if one wants to establish a data collaborative. Meaning it's very rare that you can knock on the door of a corporation or a data holder in general and say, let's do something together just because it is a good thing to do, right? So you really need to understand what's the incentive structure, what is the architecture of motivations that underpin some of those data collaboratives. And again, without going into full detail here, we have identified a whole range of incentives that actually can be leveraged for the creation of data collaboratives. And they range from reciprocity, right? I share something and I get something back. That quite often could be access to expertise or access to, for instance, analytical capabilities that you don't have within your own organization, or access to data, right? So quite often those data pools are driven, anyway, especially the ones that are based upon a club model, is that you share something and then you get something back because others are sharing something as well. And then they range from, anyway, revenue generation, right? In some cases, and again, because corporations are sharing the data, and initially that started off in the context of data philanthropy, it doesn't mean that it always has to be free, right? And so we see indeed that quite often data collaborations are now also providing for an extra line of revenue, and that could be tiered, right? So some could be free, some could be at cost, some could be indeed more at a particular pricing that enables that kind of sustainability. And we can come back to that, but I thought it was important to at least reflect that in order for data collaboration to flourish, you really, and be ready, anyway, if this is about translational, readiness, you also have to think about what's the actually incentive structure for sharing, and then the incentive structure also for using the data as well. Now, I will mainly focus today on some of the work that we have been doing around data for COVID. And so this is just two screenshots of some of the work that we have been doing when anyway, COVID hit New York, especially. We did started off a lot of initiatives. One was actually early on, and it's now a year ago, that we released a call for action, where we really realized that this is, anyway, one of the biggest challenges of the current era, and we are, from a data point of view, just not ready to respond. And so what we released there was a call for action to actually establish the data infrastructure that we need to be able to respond to pandemics such as COVID-19, but other dynamic threats, which is, of course, what Crisis Ready is focusing on as well. And so these call for action basically list 7 elements, which I will touch upon throughout the rest of the call, the presentation here as well. But also, anyway, it has been endorsed by, anyway, we had like, anyway, the first week or so, we had about 500 high-level signatories that basically indeed agreed that this is the pathway forward, and you can find that call for action there. But we also have done a lot of work in actually acting as an observatory of what is really happening in the space. And so if you go to dataforcovid19.org, there you will find probably the largest repository again of actually examples on how data and data collaboratives have been used to tackle COVID-19 across the world and across areas. And this presentation could not be better timed, Andrew, because this week we actually released two reports that I will explain further. One is around a report that we've done together with the OECD on really trying to understand how open data, open government data was used in the earlier stages of COVID-19 and whether there are some actions and lessons to be learned. And I will touch upon the really top level kind of findings. And then the second one is a more detailed understanding on how mobility data has been used to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a report that we've done, was commissioned by the Open Data Institute, and which we developed together with Cuebiq. Now, as it relates to the first report with the OECD, what we really try to understand is where does open data play a role across the crisis management cycle. And again, anyone on this call or people from Crisis Ready probably will crunch when they see this kind of simplistic crisis management cycle. But I think it is important, especially, for instance, also as it relates to COVID-19, to really understand where does data play a role and for what purpose and towards what end. And I think we really have to become more sophisticated, which is indeed why I think organizations and initiatives like Crisis Ready are so important. We need to become more sophisticated to really understand the value of data according to the different stages and the different stages of a crisis. And what we found was that open data, and of course, I do have to say is that obviously we still in many places still in actually quite often the response mode with regard to COVID-19, but still we've seen that open data mainly has been used so far to formulate a response, and that actually open data quite often is not even considered when we are looking into recovery or even thinking about readiness as such. And so we feel that that might be actually a missed opportunity to really think about how open data could be used more proactively to actually not just deal with the response, because what we saw is that open data basically was a tool to communicate with a wider audience, and that has been the main value proposition quite often of open government data, was to inform public communications with the wider world. And if you look at all the open data initiatives that we mapped and understood, then we see that most of those initiatives were indeed to basically share what is the current situation, which is the other element, is that it's not only at the response, but it's also mainly focused on situation analysis, right? Not about trying to understand some kind of causalities, that could inform recovery, for instance, right? So that you could know, anyway, if we do X, what would be the impact on Y, and what does that mean with regard to preparedness and recovery. So open government data was mainly used for situation analysis and also communication. And interestingly, right, because quite often, anyway, open data is always assumed that this is meant to share with the wider world. We actually saw that open data was mainly used by government itself, right? And as such, that's actually quite a plus, because as we all know, typically, quite often within government, it's very hard to even share data within government. And so having an open government data portal actually allowed for far more quicker sharing within government as it relates to COVID-19. And these are just a few examples on how open government data was used by government. But also, like for instance, in Brazil, it was also used to, for instance, share on how public expenditure is being conducted at the time of COVID-19, or for instance, on how stimulus funds are being disseminated. But obviously, public health was the main priority. And we see, anyway, public health quite often in a broader context. So like, for instance, in Taiwan, it was also about trying to understand the location of pharmacies selling masks, which was, of course, a key concern at the beginning of COVID-19, which led to, anyway, massive uncertainties on how you actually could protect yourself if you can't find a pharmacy that is selling masks. But in Taiwan, they basically crowdsourced and connected it with open government data in order to have an immediate response. Anyway, just a few takeaways. And again, I'm not going to go into full detail what the report is. I will put a link in the chat afterwards. But I think the big takeaway was that open government data could have had more impact if there was early on a better understanding on what are the kinds of questions that matter, right? And how do we then align open data to answer those questions during a crisis, which is why I think it's important to really think and what questions matter at what part of the crisis. And I think absent that, open data didn't really go beyond the initial communication and response. But also, anyway, what we heard over and over again is that the teams around open government data quite often were never consulted when during the crisis teams, right? So the crisis teams within governments and nations quite often never really engaged with the open government data portals. And as a result, there was a missed opportunity to actually align those data sets with actually the crisis response as well. And I think moving forward, I think it's going to be important to think about, anyway, if you create a crisis team, what role does open government data and the team behind the portal play in the development of a response and a recovery. The second report that we released this week is about mobility data. And again, I'm not going to go into detail. I think what we've tried to do in that report was to indicate that mobility data is far more than just call detail records, right? And I think at least what we've tried to do there is to provide a taxonomy of mobility data. And here, it's just an, and we also have like that taxonomy in the report, where we indicate a variety of data that could be used and that, of course, has mobility data embedded in it. We also have 5 in-depth case studies, and they range from, for instance, how Cuebiq data was used in Canada to, interesting initiative in, of course, Europe, where telecom operators were called upon by the European Commission to share their call detail records to understand mobility patterns, to initiative in Chile, London, and then also we're also looking into the use of Facebook data for good. We also released a new repository that is dedicated to mobility data, where we have 50 examples that we share on how mobility data has been used. Majority, again, around public health, no surprise. But we see also that in comparison with open government data, there was, mobility data is also more used for other kinds of questions as well. Again, very and quickly, because I don't want to go and spend too much time on this report, I'm just going to give you like the top level findings. Findings was indeed that real-time data is extremely valuable during a crisis, and that mobility data does provide that if we can figure a way to actually provide access to it, and that, again, too often at a time of crisis we have too many transaction costs that could have been handled beforehand to have rapid access to this real-time, locally relevant data. And so what we see is the need for intermediaries, such as, for instance, Crisis Ready, to really be ready when a crisis hit, to actually tap and have existing relationships with, for instance, mobility data providers to rapidly tap into those kinds of data. And a key concern, as always, right, many concerns with regard to the technical architecture and so on and so on. but it turns out that data sharing agreements are always the thing that quite often delays. And so towards that end, we also have an initiative here, Contracts for Data Collaboration, that tries to take out some of the pain in data sharing agreements, but having a data sharing agreement ready is important to access mobility data. There are other obstacles, of course, and anyway, again, I'm not going to go through all of those. These are quite often known to many of you, but I think one key is, of course, funding. And I think that's something that we saw also at the beginning of COVID-19, that many organizations were ready to jump in, but that it quite often took a lot of time to actually get the funding needed to be able to do what was needed. And so that's also something that we have worked on. So we have launched this Data for COVID Africa Challenge together with the Agence France de Développement, where we provide funding for advancing some innovations in data collaboration with mobility data as well. We also saw that actually having a methodology is important, right? Too often we see things, anyway, all those data collaboratives starting as if there is no experience and practice that can be learned from, right? So many are reinventing as they go along. And so an enabling condition is really having a methodology. And this is, for instance, our canvas to establish data collaboratives that embeds a few of those enabling conditions moving forward. And also, anyway, that we really have to start thinking about data stewardship and that needs to be in place in order to provide this kind of social license and also trust in how mobility data will be used. And because you asked me to focus on mainly translational readiness, so I thought instead of going into depth in all the other projects and some of the findings, I thought, well, what are some of the big takeaways here with regard to translational readiness? And the first one might be that we really have to, I call it going from data science to question science. But basically what I'm trying to advocate for is that we really have to become more sophisticated to rapidly and in a participatory way formulate the kinds of questions that matter that data can answer. What we see quite often is that the focus is on data, and then they figure out what can we answer with the data that we have, as opposed to what's the question that actually would allow for better decision making, that would be able, if we have an answer, generate action that can, for instance, save people's lives. And again, what we saw at the beginning of the COVID-19, there were a whole series of lists emerging of needs as it relates to, for instance, PPE equipment, but we didn't see any lists emerging of these are the questions for which we need data, right? As a collective. And I think that is basically one of the reasons why we have seen a lot of waste in the response, where anyway we have God knows how many data collaboratives that are trying to do the same thing, right? Without coordinating, and also a lot of hesitance, frankly, from the supply side to engage with all of them, because each time starting a new initiative involves costs, and as a result, a better coordination of what are the questions that matter would be would allow for this translational readiness down the line, especially if you engage those that can act upon the insight, right? So that's a first big element, is that we really have to become more sophisticated in formulating questions in a coordinated and participatory fashion. What I have here is the methodology of an initiative that we have, which is called the 100 Questions Initiative, where we actually try to come up with a set of questions that as a society we need to organize ourselves in order to answer them as well. And the methodology that we are using is to formulate those questions by engaging and creating what we call cohorts of bilinguals, which is, by the way, another key element of translational readiness, is that we really need to embrace bilinguals, which are people that have a domain expertise and a data expertise, because it's quite often those bilinguals that really can understand what are the questions that matter and how will we act upon the insight. If it's left to the data scientists, they might be brilliant in coming up with models and insights, but quite often they don't really capture the value because they don't really understand what are the elements that really make a difference, right? So we typically create communities of bilinguals. And so, for instance, in this case, it would be great to have had a cohort of bilinguals that could have said, well, these are the questions, anyway, that we all agree upon, anyway, would make a difference if we had an answer as such. And then, anyway, we source those questions, and then I can go into more detail during the Q&A on how we do this. And again, you can find the effort at the 100questions.org. Second big takeaway is indeed that we need to really experiment more with data collaboration. Once we have expressed the demand, we really need to understand what's the supply, but then of course the hard part of matching demand and supply happens. And so we really need to foster and be ready to collaborate to match demand and supply, because only then of course impact can be generated. And from our point of view, this requires what we call a professionalization of data collaboration. Doesn't mean that current data collaboratives are anyway amateuristic. It basically means that we need a new profession to really be able to set up data collaboratives and make them systematic, sustainable, and responsible. Because what we see is basically a graveyard of data collaboratives that were ad hoc, quite often not sustainable, because there was no idea on, anyway, what are we going to do once we run out of the initial seed funding or grant, and quite often, anyway, really had challenges with being seen as trusted as such. And so what we have been advocating for and are working on, and actually this week was the last week of our first cohort of our executive course on data stewardship, what we believe is that we really need to nurture that new or reimagine the concept of data stewardship, right? Typically, data stewardship is, if it exists, is mainly focused on security, cybersecurity, and privacy. But what we believe it needs to be broader and really focusing on systematic, sustainable, and responsible ways to deal with data collaboration. The other thing, and that will also provide for this translational readiness, because you will be able to actually have data stewards that understand what is the kind of data that is needed for the question, and can we help, and also the data steward can then make sure that there is action following the insight. The other thing is that, anyway, if you go for data collaboration, we also need to really acquire a social license to actually reuse data, because what we are talking about in data collaboratives is really the reuse of data, right? That was collected for one purpose and you reuse it for another purpose. In this case, for instance, COVID-19. Now, that reuse automatically means that you actually do need to have a social license to do so. Otherwise, there will be a major backlash. And so that means quite often engaging with the public at large. And so what we developed here in New York in the summer was the data assembly, which was the first ever kind of citizens assembly around the use and the reuse of data in New York City for COVID-19. And what we developed, co-created with New Yorkers and civic rights organizations and data holders, was basically this responsible data reuse framework that can inform the reuse of data for other purposes. And so, again, happy to share that later on, but that's an element that will enable the readiness because it will provide the license to do so. And I think that's another element. And then last but not least, and again, this in itself is a course that needs to be developed quite often, which is how do we turn data intelligence into decision intelligence? Quite often, data collaboratives we see are really good at the first part, right? Generating from data to insight. But then how do we go from insight to decisions, where we mean how does it inform, anyway, the selection of options across the data lifecycle? And especially, I think what we need to do is become more sophisticated, that there is not just one decision, right? But that data insights can really be used across the decision lifecycle, right? And that includes, for instance, defining the question, right? So we can actually use data to define the question, but also to anyway, be more ready across the data lifecycle. And I've just put a picture there of something that I feel we need a lot more experimentation with. This is a picture of the so-called decision theater that Arizona State University has built. And I think what is really interesting is that we need to think about what are virtual decision theaters and who needs to be part of that theater, and how does then indeed data collaboratives focus on that. And I think there are some really interesting lessons learned. Again, these are some observations, mainly to stimulate dialogue. And I didn't want to come here and say we figured it all out, but I think there are some areas where we collectively can make progress by really professionalizing data collaboration, but also becoming more sophisticated in how we formulate questions and then act upon the insight generated. And anyway, these are just a few newsletters that we also develop where you can stay up to date with some of our work. With that, Andrew, I realized I probably went over time, and I apologize. So that's what you get when you give an academic the floor. They always grab it and spend more time than necessary.
No, no problem. We have webinar readiness, so we were ready to go. Thank you very much. There's just so much to follow up on that. I wanted to maybe just quickly kick it over to my colleague Sachin Balsari to provide some initial thoughts on, I mean, any part of what you were just describing, and then we can. I want to encourage also the folks that are in the audience here to put questions into the Q&A, and we will, of course, follow them up. But thank you very much, Sachin.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Stefan. I just wanted to draw the audience's attention to what you dropped in the chat right now. I think that would have been an obvious request from everyone, so thank you. Just seeing who's in the audience today, would very much welcome this to be an open Q&A. I think it'll really enrich the conversation. I don't want to monopolize this, this time. But I will take the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions, Stefan. Thank you for sharing all of that, and then sort of for the provocative directions in which you are taking this conversation as well, and you know, these ideas of sort of data stewards. You mentioned transaction costs a couple of times in terms of, you know, what are the business incentives to maintain these data collaboratives. Can I build on that question and ask, what are the business incentives to maintain these data collaboratives in peacetime? I think 2020, you know, was really quite the outlier. It was easy to get all these people. People felt desperate. Just your thoughts or concerns around what the incentives might be a couple of years from now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the, thanks, Sajid, for posing the 100 billion question from the outset here. But I think that's anyway, that's one of the real challenges, right? And I think, well, first of all, I think we shouldn't assume that there are no important decisions to be made outside of during peacetime, right? And so, I mean, I think we can make the case that anyway, we are in a almost, anyway, if we just think about the climate crisis that we have, we are like in an ongoing crisis, and that will be, anyway, hopefully be a motivating role. Same for, anyway, urbanization and so on. So there are X amount of use cases where access to the data would be a big benefit. There is, anyway, there are a whole range of incentives, I think, that one needs to take into account. One is, of course, corporate social responsibility. I mean, I've written about this as well, as you know, Sajid. I see this as the new kind of corporate social responsibility of the data age, right? And I think we really need to position it and advocate for that more, is that if you are a corporation and you have data, then everyone and actually had a call yesterday also really trying to make this a corporate board issue, right? Corporate boards should start thinking about what have we done with the data that we have, not just to increase the profit and bottom line, but also what have we done to actually support and improve the environment in which our business operates, right? And I think corporate social responsibility is going to be a big thing, and more corporations are starting to see this. I see this similar as the whole question about sustainability, right? So now many major corporations have a chief sustainability officer, right? And report to the board. I think the same is going to happen and should happen with the chief data steward, right? That they actually basically take this seriously and see this as, anyway, what have we done with the data that not just for, anyway, because most of it is about compliance and protecting, but also in a more proactive way. So that's one. Two, I expect that there will be more and more legislation, and as you know, I was a member to the Europe of the expert group to the European Commission on business to government data sharing. That is now being taken very seriously at the European level on how would you provide actually a mandate to access data during, anyway, not only crisis mode, but also for other purposes, such as improving statistical agencies, right, and their insight. So I think we will see more of that kind of regulation and legislation happen. In Europe, there are already 3 countries where there is laws on the books that provide a mandate to access corporate data. So you will have that. But then, of course, there are other ways as well. And I think corporations are like, anyway, as corporations have figured out that sustainability is actually a business model as well, right? I think they are now also figuring out that actually using data for social purposes generates capabilities that they can use for business purposes as well. And I think that's what we see a lot, is this kind of creative thinking within corporations around, well, I mean, it might be a cost, right? There might be an investment cost, but you know what? The return for the business goes beyond supporting public good initiatives, and actually makes us far more efficient in how we use data as well. Anyway, that's just the start, Sajid. There's a lot more to unpack there. And frankly, anyway, what we are working on right now is to actually really develop a cost-benefit tool, because in most cases, people don't even have an idea on what the costs are and the benefits are of doing this, and making this more transparent and systematizing it again, so that you know these are the investment costs, but then these are the indirect benefits I generate from that, right? Having that is will make it more professional, as opposed to, oh, let's do good today because there is a crisis, right?
It's, no, thank you for that very, very thoughtful response. And you know, this so two follow-up comments to that. The regulatory space is going to be very interesting to watch. There will be a lot of tension because there are totally different models right now in Europe and the US around how to regulate these data. And India, you know, as it works on its non-personal data privacy bill, is trying to insist that these data should be pooled into data commons. And there is going to be a lot of resistance from US-based technology companies to comply with that. And you know, this yes, the CSR benefits of, you know, the intangibles which will then sort of support business is one approach, and we will find a lot of resistance coming from the policy and the ethics space as well, saying, you know, that remains unregulated. You are allowing them to self-govern, yes, data for good, but it's very arbitrary, and you know, they get to set the parameters of what is shared and how it is shared. So it'll,
yeah, no, I agree with that, and that's why I think we're gonna have to figure out a way to first of all coordinate the questions, because imagine that, anyway, from tomorrow onwards, this is anyway all regulated, and anyone who has an important question can knock on the door of corporations, right? Well, good luck with that.
Yeah.
So we do need to come up with ways to coordinate that, which is why anyway we will probably see more trusted intermediaries that act as the ones that review the requests and can model with that. And again, we've had some examples there, but not all are successful, right? And I'm not going to point to a few that have turned out to be harder to establish than anticipated. But also we do need to then have indeed a more public conversation about reuse. As I said, most privacy legislation, including GDPR, and anyway the ones that are in the US, whether it's in California or now Virginia as well, basically are still based upon the FIPS, right? So the Fair Information Practice Principles, right? Which still anyway are based upon kind of a notion of purpose specification, right? And that you can only use the data for the purpose for which it was specified. What we are talking about here goes straight against that, right? And it's really about reusing data that was collected for one purpose for another purpose. And I think that's where I feel like we need a lot more public conversation about. We need clearer policies that says for those kind of purposes, that's like crossing a line, right? You should never do that. And I think if we would have a better understanding on, and that's what we've tried to do here, like in with the data assembly, was to really try to probe what are people's expectations with regard to use cases, right? Because again, this is kind of quite often yes on binary, right? Well, it depends, right? It depends on the use case. It depends on who is accessing the data. It depends who is providing the data. And so having that more sophistication is going to be important. But frankly, I would say the field would already benefit from having a list of these are the use cases we would not see, right? And then having a set of use cases. These are use cases we would actually would like to see more of, right? Under the right conditions. And that's something perhaps that you guys or together we can have this kind of more conversation on actually what are people's expectations, because it's not black and it's not like binary, right? From my point of view.
There are lessons to be learned from other disciplines as well, right? The biomedical sciences have had this question, these challenges with repurposing tissues, and have had sort of this round of ethical debates. I wanted to point you to a question from Nick Jones here from the GFDRR of the World Bank in the chat window. The key challenge, Nick says, is that the data show that data sets may overrepresent folks with means because they have smartphones. Does that present a major challenge during the COVID response, and have researchers shown how to surmount it?
I'm wondering if I can also piggyback on that around the questions that you were drawing attention to about these bilinguals, around the kind of broad-based capacity that's required in order to make this kind of data to decision loop work. Questions around who gets to pose the questions actually. Sort of, it seems like there's a kind of broad question around disparity here about concentration in the global north, not only of data, not only of access to technology in some cases, although that's changing, but of who's actually doing the analysis on some of these things. So like, how do you actually account for how we kind of move forward in here with all of these different dimensions of bias that are kind of baked into what we're talking about?
Right. Yeah. Another big question, Andrew and Nicola. Yeah. No. Well, obviously, I think the whole idea that at a certain point in time, the whole idea that big data, right, N is all, right, is not the case, right? It's obviously never fully representative, right? And there are always biases depending on the type of how it was collected, right? And what was the device that was being used to collect the data. So obviously, I think it has to be fully acknowledged that that there are biases. which is why, by the way, anyway, quite often, anyway, the other big discussion was always like, well, anyway, why don't we just have private sector data and ignore census data, right? Well, you do need to have a way to ground truth some of the data as well, right? And so ground truthing is key with regard to using some of that data, and that's one way to go about it, right? At the same time, anyway, at the time of urgency, the question is, of course, anyway, clearly, what is good enough representation, right? And I think those are some of the elements that need to be taken into account. But there are obviously major equity issues involved in the sense that in some cases, anyway, you have people that are invisible, i.e. are not in the data sets that are being collected. And that's something that, anyway, from a data science point of view, you then need to recalibrate, and it's never going to be 100% perfect as well. Coming to your questions on how do we establish also a certain sense of equity in actually in you know, the ecosystem of generating insights, and that's exactly where I think we need to develop new participatory processes in even designing what are the questions, right? Like for instance, what we do is that anyway, we have those bilinguals in order to get at least a set of quality questions going, but then we have a public voting associated with it so that the public can actually chime in on, well, these are questions that matter, but anyway, at the ground, in my community, those are the questions that I need to be able to answer in order to make decisions that can improve my life. And so having that kind of, anyway, what we have a two-stage process, but we need to experiment. And again, Andrew, I'm not saying we have figured this out. I'm just saying is that we just need to be sensitive that we do need to be more inclusive across the data lifecycle, right? And I think that's a big task ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. And because I think it touches on the other kind of term in the title of this webinar is around capacity building as well.
Right.
So like, I think there's a need to build capacity in, areas you've mentioned around, data methods, improve the science, et cetera. But what about capacity to ask questions actually, as one of the key capacities that needs to be developed? And that's in some ways in the humanitarian space, this focuses on the localization agenda, on where the money goes. So you mentioned funding as a priority, funding for localized initiatives that are capable of affecting the agenda is actually something that is a major need kind of across the space. Where are the incentives to move that funding towards, whether that's localized NGOs or municipal government, or, other layers of people that have very meaningful inputs here, but may often not have access to the kind of global public sphere as you've kind of laid it out here, which seems like what we're talking about in some ways.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you again, Andrew. And again, as you know, I was at the foundation many years, and quite often, indeed, anyway, it's quite often easier to fund a nice solution without, anyway, taking time to really understand the problem, right? And I think having increased capacity for problem definition, increased capacity for formulating questions, I think that's exactly what I think, by the way, will benefit translational readiness, right? Mm-hmm. Because anyway, quite often you get insights and then, well, does it actually relate to a problem that we seek to solve, right? And I think being part, anyway, of formulating the question early on, right, will generate much easier, right, from insight to action kind of decision making. And I think that's the thing. But it's not easy, meaning I think, anyway, we at GovLab, we created something called the GovLab Academy early on. And that basically was an academy for teams working on civic tech and data. And the first question that we always asked at the academy, it was, can you define the problem you seek to address, right? Mm-hmm. And we had like, anyway, hundreds of people going through the academy, and we couldn't identify a single team that actually had a really well-developed problem definition. They all had a really good understanding of this is what we want to build.
Right.
But actually spending more time on the question and the problem is exactly a key element, and will, which is why I'm also, anyway, like for instance, COVID-19, as I said, I mean, we could have done better. Of course, this was a total, anyway, chaos, right? But we could have done better as a community to really also reflect some priority areas. And of course, you guys have done a really good job towards that end. But I think it could have been, anyway, there would have been a lot less waste and more targeted interventions if there would have been early on an intervention of saying, okay, this is happening. This is a pandemic. We've had other pandemics before. What are some of the key questions, right, that we should try to answer, and how do we align ourselves as a community as opposed to individual initiatives, right?
Just a note, Sachin and I were going back and forth saying that we actually did this. We actually outlined these questions, and we couldn't figure out how to get them into circulation. We actually went back and forth. We had, I mean, how many did we have? We had easily 100, easily. And it is a question of posing it, not even just formulating. Like, where are the mechanisms by which that gets into dialogue? I think that is also a kind of key capacity question.
Right. I would love to see those questions, by the way.
Sachin, did you want to like close out with any?
No, this you know, the conversations to be continued, right? And just looking at who's in the room, we're all struggling with this. And Stefan, thank you for you know, providing frameworks within which to have this dialogue. Looking forward to chatting with you again on the Radcliffe seminars next week, and then in a public forum. I think we hope to update other colleagues on conversations from the seminar. Just to remind everyone, there's a series of seminars being held on campus remotely, where technology companies, scientists, policymakers, and practitioners have been convened to understand what priority areas we collectively need to focus on, you know, just bottlenecks to allow this kind of work to scale, whether it's regulatory, whether it's methodological. And the white paper that we hope to draft based on those conversations will be available for public review and comment. And we're very much hoping we can tap into this ecosystem of colleagues to help write that will hopefully drive our collective mission forward. And you know, Nick Jones and I've been exchanging a lot of messages every time you speak, Stefan, about how we need to put more work in your lap. Just giving you a heads up. Thank you kindly for agreeing to do this, and thanks everyone for joining on a Friday morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Likewise. Thank you, Stefan. Look forward to following up.